You're what happens when standards fall low enough to let anyone wear scrubs. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before a decorated combat medic coded in room 804. St. Michael's ICU smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum like they're asking for forgiveness. Rachel Torres moves through her third month as a temp nurse with the invisible efficiency of someone who learned long ago that being seen is dangerous. Her hands log vitals on the monitor, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, heart rate, with the mechanical precision of someone whose hands have done much harder things than this. The scrubs hide the rope-burn scars across her forearms, pale lines that catch light if you know where to look. Nobody looks. In her locker, shoved behind a spare pair of compression socks and a name badge that doesn't reflect her real rank, sits a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is cracked at the toe box. Dried sand still cakes the treads, Tikrit sand, the color of rust and regret. She keeps them there the way some people keep photographs. Proof that she existed before the government erased her, before she became Rachel Torres, temporary contract nurse, invisible background figure in other people's medical dramas. Dr. Whitfield controls the ICU like a general controls occupied territory. 15 years. That's how long he's held the cardiothoracic chief position at St. Michael's, and the way he moves through the corridors makes it clear he considers the entire wing his personal fiefdom. He's the kind of man whose presence makes the air pressure change, not because he's impressive, but because everyone around him instinctively prepares to be wrong. His eyes are the pale blue of winter ice, and his voice carries the particular confidence of someone who has never, in his entire medical career, admitted uncertainty in front of a witness. Rachel understands men like this. She's served with them. She's watched them make decisions that cost lives because admitting doubt was impossible in their internal hierarchy. Grand rounds happen every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. sharp. The residents file in behind Whitfield like ducklings following a mother who actively resents them. He moves from bed to bed, consulting the charts, delivering opinions with the weight of biblical pronouncement. Rachel stands at the medication cart in her usual position, present but peripheral, the kind of background fixture that people forget is listening. She's very good at being forgotten. At bed 312, Whitfield stops. He holds up her charting notes like they're evidence of contamination. The fluorescent lights catch the edges of the paper, making shadows dance across the residents' faces. This is what we're calling adequate documentation standards now. His voice fills the space like water filling a container. Look at this entry from 0600. No specificity. No clinical correlation. It's as if she doesn't understand the difference between observation and assessment. He reads her words aloud. Her words. Rachel's jaw tightens, not visibly, just the muscles at the hinge of her jaw clenching once, then releasing. She's trained for much worse than humiliation. She's trained for things that would make these residents weep. The residents smirk because that's what residents do when a superior is establishing dominance. They align themselves with power. It's instinct. Rachel continues documenting the 0745 vitals for room 808. Her hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. Pain is information. Insult is just data about the person delivering it. 2 days later, there's an encounter at the vending machine on the 4th floor. Rachel isn't sure if it's chance or design. With someone like Whitfield, it's usually design. He's standing there in his white coat, waiting for his coffee to dispense, when she approaches. She needs water. That's all. Simple transaction. Get water, return to work. Torres. He doesn't turn to face her. You did graduate nursing school, didn't you? It's just, your documentation style makes me wonder if perhaps you skipped the clinical reasoning component. There are 11 people within earshot. Rachel counted them without looking, 2 residents, 3 nurses, a phlebotomist, an elderly patient in a wheelchair, 2 family members, and a security guard reviewing footage on a monitor in the corner. Whitfield knows this. He's chosen this moment with precision. He's a craftsman of humiliation. Yes, doctor. Her voice is neutral, measured. The kind of voice that gives nothing away. She takes her water and leaves. The security guard blinks. He almost says something. He doesn't. Room 804 holds Captain James Torres, no relation to Rachel, but connected anyway through the thin wire of command structure that never fully dissolves. James was her son's commanding officer during deployment to Sanjin Valley, Helm and Province. He came through her son's last rotation with a recommendation letter and a handshake. Now he's here post-op, fighting complications that the day shift missed. A fever that shouldn't be there. A drainage line that's producing fluid the color of weak tea instead of the clear serous fluid it should be. The monitors show his heart working too hard, oxygen saturation dropping toward numbers that trigger alarms. Rachel reads his chart. She reads it the way she reads everything, with the full attention of someone whose job used to involve reading intelligence reports and responding in the dark. She notices things. A medication order that doesn't align with his renal function. A dosing calculation that works perfectly on paper but creates a real problem in a real body. Aminoglycosides accumulate. That's not complexity. That's 9th grade pharmacology. She finds Whitfield in his office. The door is open. His desk is mahogany and his chair is leather, and the diplomas on his wall are from prestigious institutions. Yale Medical School. Harvard residency. The trappings of someone for whom excellence has always been attainable. Doctor, I'm concerned about the gentamicin dosing on Captain Torres. His creatinine is 1.8. The current dose is calculated for a creatinine of 1.2. He's going to accumulate to toxic levels in 36 hours. Whitfield looks up from his computer. His expression doesn't change. This is important. If he shows frustration now, the narrative might shift slightly. Instead, he becomes very still. Very calm. Are you questioning my clinical judgment? I'm flagging a dosing error. I didn't ask you to review medications, Torres. I asked you to change bedpans and monitor vital signs. There is a significant difference. Now, if you continue to overstep your scope, if you continue to question decisions made by physicians, I'll have no choice but to call security and have you escorted out. For your own safety, you understand. We can't have unqualified people making clinical recommendations. It creates liability for the institution. Rachel nods once. She doesn't argue. Arguing is for people with something to lose. She has nothing to lose. She already lost everything 5 years ago when she became a ghost. Yes, doctor. She turns and walks back out into the corridor. Past the nurse's station. Past the medication cart. To the supply closet on the east wing, 3 doors down from the stairwell. She closes the door behind her. The closet smells like bleach and the plastic scent of sterile packaging. She stands there in the dark for 30 seconds. Her hands, shaking, no, not shaking. Trembling with something that looks like emotion but is actually just the accumulated weight of 5 years of invisibility finally pressing down on a structure that can only hold so much. She allows herself one exhale. Long, controlled, the kind of breath people take when they're resurfacing from water. Then she opens the door and returns to her patient assessments. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that would change everything. That came 47 minutes later, when Captain James Torres's monitor began shrieking its warning code into the silence of the night shift, when his body betrayed the dosing calculations on paper, when Rachel would have approximately 4 minutes to make a choice that would either save his life or confirm everything Dr. Whitfield had said about her qualifications. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. During grand rounds Thursday morning, Dr. Whitfield held up Rachel's patient charts like contaminated evidence before 12 residents and for attending physicians in the conference room. "Class, this is what inadequate documentation looks like," he announced, his voice carrying the theatrical disgust of a sommelier finding cork in expensive wine. He read her notes aloud, pausing after each section like a prosecutor building a case. "Patient comfortable, comfortable? That's your clinical assessment? Did they teach diagnosis by feelings at whatever school issued your degree?" The resident smirked on cue. Rachel stood against the back wall, jaw muscles tightening imperceptibly, hands clasped behind her back in parade rest she didn't realize she'd assumed. Her face showed nothing. The lights hummed overhead. One resident whispered something to another. Rachel's eyes didn't move. By Tuesday, the whispers had multiplied into something heavier, the kind of departmental perception that spreads like bacteria through agar, invisible until it's already everywhere. Nurses avoided standing near her at the med cart. An attending who'd previously nodded hello now looked past her in the hallway. Whitfield had done what he intended. He'd marked her as weak, temporary, untrustworthy. A liability that could be safely dismissed when the moment came. 2 days after grand rounds, Whitfield engineered the vending machine encounter during shift change when the staff lounge crowded with incoming and outgoing nurses, 2 residents, and a surgical tech refilling her water bottle. Rachel was reaching for coffee when Whitfield blocked her path, leaning against the machine with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone that mattered. Torres, any relation to actual medical professionals, or is that just coincidence? His voice carried across the lounge like he'd meant for everyone to hear. Because he had. Because I'm starting to wonder if you actually graduated nursing school or just bought scrubs online. Check the internet, I hear they sell everything now. He smiled. The smile was the worst part. Not anger. Not even disdain. Just the serene satisfaction of a predator that knows its prey can't fight back. Rachel met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Her jaw didn't clench this time. Her breathing didn't change. She nodded once, slowly, the kind of acknowledgement you give someone who's just confirmed what you already knew. Then she took her coffee and stepped around him with the precision of someone navigating through a minefield. The room had gone very still. She could feel the weight of their stares as she returned to her scrubs pocket, as she moved toward the stairwell door, as she climbed back to the ICU where Captain Torres lay in room 804, still fighting the aftermath of surgery, still unaware that his former commanding officer's wife was now walking on a wire above a pit that was getting darker every day. In the stairwell between floors, alone, Rachel gripped the metal railing hard enough that her knuckles went white. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. The trembling was restraint, the physical manifestation of years of training in controlled response, of knowing that one moment of reaction could end everything, that one raised voice could trigger the protocols that would pull her records, that would activate the legal mechanisms designed to erase her, that would send federal agents to collect what remained. So she breathed. In through her nose. Out through her mouth. Once. Twice. 3 times. The trembling stopped. Her hand steadied. She released the railing and continued climbing to the ICU, where her shift was 4 hours from ending and where the next 12 hours would decide whether she kept her locker and her boots and her one remaining foothold in a normal life. The following Tuesday, Rachel quietly flagged a dosing error in Dr. Whitfield's post-op orders for Captain Torres. Double the recommended beta-blocker dose for a patient with Torres's cardiac history and compromised renal function. A mistake that would have manifested within hours, rapid bradycardia, potential cardiogenic shock, possible arrest. She documented the discrepancy in the chart with the precision she'd learned in the field, where medical errors weren't corrected by ethics committees but by body bags. She flagged it to the charge nurse. She knew it would reach Whitfield. She also knew what would happen when it did. He found her at the nurses' station at 3:15 p.m. when the ICU was understaffed and witnesses were thin on the ground but not non-existent. "You're questioning my clinical judgment." His voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than the vending machine performance. His hands were flat on the desk, framing her patient charts. "I can have security escort you out of this building in the next 5 minutes. The temp agency is very responsive when board-certified surgeons raise concerns about staff competency. They're also responsive to recommendations." He leaned closer. "You understand what that means, don't you? 1 call and you're not just fired. You're unemployable in the Portland metro area. Every hospital will know Dr. Whitfield said you were a liability." He smiled again. That serene, satisfied smile. "Now." Do we need to escalate this, or are we going to let the adults handle the medicine? Rachel said nothing. Her hands remained visible on the desk, flat and still. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, then 3, then 4, long enough that something flicked across his expression, confusion, maybe, or the first tiny doubt that cracked his certainty. Then she withdrew her hands and nodded. Just nodded. She turned and walked to room 804 to check on Captain Torres's vitals, on his oxygen saturation and his blood pressure and his heart rhythm, on everything that mattered. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 30 seconds later when Rachel reached the medication supply closet. She stepped inside and pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving, and for the first time since Tikrit, her hand shook for reasons that had nothing to do with restraint. The boots were still in her locker. The boots that meant something. The boots that represented a person she'd been and a life she'd lived and a legacy of service that Whitfield would never understand because he'd built his authority on titles and politics instead of on the kind of competence you earn when there's no backup, when it's just you and your hands and a choice between saving a life or letting it slip away. She could feel them there, 3 floors below, waiting. She just didn't know how many more shifts she had left to wear them. The night shift began at 7 p.m. with routine rounds, blood draws, medication schedules, the steady rhythm of ICU work. Rachel moved through it with the same focus she'd brought to every task since the day Whitfield started his campaign. Thorough. Quiet. Precise. Captain Torres in 804 was resting comfortably after his triple bypass, his surgical site clean, his vitals stable. His daughter was flying in tomorrow to see him, first visit since his surgery. He didn't know Rachel had saved his life 3 years ago under a false name in a place that didn't officially exist. He didn't know she donated bone marrow to save his child. He knew nothing except that the quiet nurse was always there, always attentive, always reading the data that doctors missed. At 2:22 a.m., the code blue alarm shattered the night shift calm like artillery fire through a quiet compound. Room 804. The monitor showed VFib. Rachel was first through the door, muscle memory and instinct moving faster than thought, and in the space of 3 seconds she saw the problem that the day's shift had missed, the dehiscing sternotomy incision, the sternal separation, the signs of infection she documented twice in her shift notes that nobody had read carefully enough to prevent this. Captain Torres's chest was opening like a flower blooming backward, and his heart had stopped, and there was no time for the surgical team to arrive before the window closed forever. The crash cart was positioned. Gloves snapped on. 2 residents froze in the doorway like statues in a museum nobody visited. Dr. Whitfield arrived shouting contradictory orders: get her away from that patient, start compressions, where's anesthesia, someone call surgery, but Rachel's hands were already inside Torres's chest, fingers on his heart, performing direct cardiac massage with the kind of precision that only came from having done it while bullets came through the walls and dust settled on everything, and the only thing between your patient and death was the strength of your hands and the steadiness of your nerve. For minutes. The monitor traced a rhythm. Slow at first, then climbing. 45, 62, 78, sinus rhythm. Torres's pupils responded to light. The muscle memory released her hands and she withdrew them slowly, accepting the gauze a nurse offered with shaking hands of her own, and she began the sterile closure protocol without meeting anyone's eyes, knowing that what she'd just done in this sterile room in Portland, Oregon had just changed everything about her situation, about her safety, about the carefully constructed wall that had kept her identity buried for 5 years. By 6 a.m., Dr. Whitfield was in his office making phone calls. The code blue alarm shattered the 2:06 a.m. silence like a sniper round through glass. Room 804. ICU. Rachel was halfway across the unit when the second alarm sounded, then a third, the intercom crackling with controlled urgency that made her spine straighten. She didn't run. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd walked into worse things than a coding patient. Through the double doors. Gloved. Gowned. The smell of antiseptic and adrenaline thick enough to taste. Captain James Torres was seizing on the bed, his sternotomy incision splitting open like a mouth screaming. The surgical site was dehiscing, the wound separating, the chest wall compromised. His monitors shrieked their warnings. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen sat in free fall. 88. 76. 62. Dr. Whitfield stood in the doorway, his mouth opening and closing, words that contradicted each other pouring out like static from a broken radio. Get me 500 ccs of, no, wait, push the epi first. His hands moved but his eyes didn't track what was happening on the bed. He was watching himself, not the patient. Performing. The residents froze. 3 of them. 20-something years old, still learning the difference between textbook and catastrophe. One of them reached for nothing. Another step backward. Rachel didn't speak. Muscle memory from Tikrit activated like a switch being flipped in her nervous system. Her hands moved on their own, decades of field medicine remembering what her civilian scrubs were supposed to forget. She was already positioning the bed, tilting Torres's chest, her fingers finding the correct intercostal space between the 4th and 5th ribs without hesitation or prayer. Scalpel, she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Excuse me. Whitfield's head snapped toward her. Who authorized? Scalpel. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command that rearranged the air in the room. A resident moved. The scalpel appeared in Rachel's hand before Whitfield finished his next breath. The blade went in with the confidence of someone who'd done this intense under fire, in hums rolling across desert that wanted to kill her, in safe houses where the alternative to action was watching someone die. The sternum split open. Direct cardiac massage. Her gloved hand inside the chest cavity, fingers finding the heart, a fist-sized thing that had forgotten how to beat on its own. She compressed. Once. Twice. The rhythm of it as old as war. Blood pooled and she kept moving, kept working, kept the pressure constant and deep and perfect. Epi, 1 milligram for push, she said. Someone moved. The resident with the shaky hands actually got it right. Whitfield was still talking. His voice had become something thin and desperate. This is highly irregular, we need to follow protocol. Your protocol is killing him, Rachel said. Not angry. Not emotional. Just a statement of fact, the way you might mention the weather. She'd seen men die because of protocol. She'd seen women. She'd seen children. The heart under her hand responded to blood and oxygen and pressure, not regulations and hierarchy. 90 seconds in. Torres's blood pressure was still catastrophic. O2 sat hovering in the dangerous zone. 70. 73. 79. Continue compressions, someone whispered. A nurse. Following Rachel now, not Whitfield. Following the person whose hands were keeping a man alive. 2 minutes in. The monitors started to sing a different song. The rhythm changed. Not normal, but not the screaming flatline that had brought them running. The heart was working. Damaged, barely functional, but trying. His blood pressure crept upward. 85/52. 88/55. Rachel maintained the compressions. For minutes in. The oxygen saturation stabilized at 86%. Not perfect. Not safe. But livable. We need him in the OR, she said, still not looking at Whitfield. Stat surgical consult for sternal rewiring. He's going to arrest again if we don't get him stabilized. She stepped back only when the surgical team arrived, only when Torres was moving toward the operating room, only when someone else had taken the work that had been hers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like mechanized wasps. Her gloved hands were dark with blood. The smell of it was copper and salt and human desperation. Whitfield was staring at her. His jaw worked but nothing came out. The residents were staring too. One of them, the young woman with the dark hair, had her hand over her mouth. The moment stretched like taffy, like something being pulled until it had to break. Someone order those blood products, Rachel said quietly. She pulled off her gloves. Snapped them off like gunshots in the silence. And Torres needs cardiac enzymes at 6 and 12 hours. His troponin is going to be elevated. She turned and walked out of room 804. Behind her, Dr. Whitfield's office phone was ringing. She knew what that meant. She could feel the machinery of his response already spinning up, already calculating, already moving to neutralize the threat that had just made him look incompetent in front of his residents. A threat had saved a life and made him irrelevant in the process. By 6 a.m., Whitfield had made 7 phone calls. By 7 a.m., he'd contacted the temp agency with a fabricated report claiming Rachel had consistently exceeded her scope of practice, ignored direct orders, and demonstrated a pattern of insubordination requiring immediate review. By 8 a.m., he'd called in a favor from a retired surgeon named Dr. Marcus Bennett, someone Whitfield had mentored 15 years ago, someone who owed him, someone who would come with a predetermined opinion and a briefcase full of assumptions. Bennett arrived at 9:56 a.m. with the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong in his own mind. Rachel received her reassignment notice at 11 a.m. while sitting at the triage desk. Pediatric ward, effective immediately. Patient continuity concerns, the charge nurse said apologetically. Not her decision. Orders from above. She nodded once and returned to documenting vitals. The pen moved in her hand like it belonged to someone else. At 1 p.m., her name was called over the intercom. Conference room on the 2nd floor. When she arrived, Whitfield was there with Bennett and 2 HR representatives whose names she didn't catch. One of them was holding a folder that was too thin to contain anything but certainty. Ms. Torres, the HR woman began, and Rachel heard the rehearsal in her voice, the script she'd been given. Dr. Whitfield has raised serious concerns about your performance and your conduct during last night's emergency in room 804. Rachel said nothing. Dr. Bennett has reviewed the incident and determined that your actions constituted gross deviation from established protocols. You performed an emergency thoracotomy without authorization, without attending physician approval, and without credentials that justify such intervention. The words fell like bricks. Rachel's hands rested on the table in front of her. Steady. Still. Your employment with St. Michael's is terminated effective immediately. Dr. Whitfield has also contacted your temp agency, which has removed you from their available roster. This letter documents the reasons for termination. Someone placed a folder in front of her. Rachel didn't open it. She knew what it said. She could have written it herself. She'd learned the language of bureaucratic erasure long before she became a nurse. The military had taught her how to disappear. The government had made her invisible. This was just another variation on the same theme. Your badge needs to be surrendered before you leave the building, the second HR representative said. A man. Careful not to make eye contact. Rachel stood. She unclipped the badge from her waistband, the one she'd been issued 3 months ago, the one that had gotten her into patient rooms and medication dispensaries and the ICU where she'd been invisible enough to save a man's life. She placed it on the table. I want to be clear, Bennett said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd never had to prove. This incident will be noted in your professional record. Your nursing license may be subject to review by the state board. Rachel looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the tailored suit that cost more than her monthly rent. She saw the Rolex that probably cost $12,000. She saw a man who had never held a life in his hands and felt it slip away. Who had never had to decide what to do when there was nothing left to do but act. I need to inform you that we've already contacted the Oregon Board of Nursing, the HR woman continued. The investigation has been flagged as priority. But Rachel wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking about what it meant to have already been erased once. What it meant to have survived being deleted from official records, scrubbed from the system after Tikrit, told that surfacing meant prison or worse for violating national security protocols she'd never read or agreed to. They told her not to exist. And she'd learned that lesson well. The temp agency had her social security number. The Board of Nursing had her license. The hospital had her fingerprints from onboarding. There was nowhere left to run in this system. She was about to be erased again, and this time it was going to stick. Rachel walked out of the conference room without another word. Down the corridor. Past the break room where nurses were eating lunch and pretending not to watch her leave. Down the stairwell. The doors to the parking garage opened with a pneumatic hiss. Her car was on level B2, in a corner spot where the overhead lights flickered. She got in, closed the door, and rested her forehead against the steering wheel. The termination letter was on the passenger seat. The hospital badge was still in her hand. Her boots were in her locker 3 levels above, gathering dust next to a life she'd tried so hard to leave behind. She couldn't remember how to make her hands unclench. By morning, the investigation was already moving. Dr. Whitfield sat in his office with the door locked, his fingers trembling as he dialed the first number, retired cardiac surgeon Bennett Hayes, who owed him a favor from a malpractice case 6 years ago. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Hayes agreed to sign off on a statement questioning Rachel's procedural knowledge, her judgment under pressure, her documentation standards. No specifics. Just enough doubt to poison the water. The second call went to hospital administrator Richard Pierce, who'd served on the board with Whitfield for 8 years. Whitfield didn't ask directly. He just mentioned Rachel's unauthorized procedures during the code, the deviation from protocol, the liability exposure if the wrong journalist started asking questions. He mentioned the phrase inadequate supervision of temporary staff twice. Pierce's voice shifted. By the end of the call, Pierce was already thinking about how to frame this as a systemic failure, how to distance the hospital before anyone else heard about it. The third call went to Dr. Marcus Sterling, Chief of Staff. This one was different. Whitfield had photographs, Rachel's temp badge application, the gaps in her employment history, the vague references she'd provided. He didn't mention the code. He didn't have to. He just said the words background concerns and risk management and let Sterling's legal training fill in the blanks. Sterling had already been burned by a credentialing lawsuit 5 years prior. He heard what Whitfield wasn't saying and understood the chess move perfectly. By 8 a.m., Whitfield had made the call to the temp agency. This was the brilliant part, no grand accusation, just a quiet conversation with the agency's HR manager. He documented 3 instances of performance concerns. One was fabricated entirely. Another twisted Rachel's flagging of his medication error into questioning physician judgment inappropriately. The third referenced her limited ability to follow departmental protocols. Nothing that would hold up under scrutiny, but everything a temp agency needed to hear to mark a worker as unreliable. An external hospital investigator named David Rothschild was contracted by Noon. Whitfield had worked with him before, a meticulous man who understood that investigations often found what they were paid to find. The scope was narrow: review the code blue procedures, assess whether the temporary nursing staff member had overstepped her authority, determine if any liability existed. Rothschild was given Whitfield's narrative first. He was shown the documented medication error, the one Rachel had caught, and told it was an example of her pattern of insubordination. He was shown the vending machine encounter, redacted to remove any suggestion of prior humiliation, and repositioned as evidence of Rachel's confrontational nature. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their thin, mechanical song. By 2 p.m., Rachel was called into the HR office on the 4th floor. The termination letter was already typed. The temp agency had officially withdrawn her from the schedule. The external investigator's preliminary report, completed in less than 4 hours, recommended the hospital issue a formal disavowal of Rachel's actions during the Code Blue, noting that her unauthorized direct intervention had been potentially dangerous despite the positive outcome. Liability, the report concluded, might be mitigated if the hospital acted decisively to distance itself from the temporary employee's conduct. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Volkov who'd never spoken more than 5 words to Rachel, slid the letter across the desk. Your temp contract is terminated effective immediately. You're not to return to the unit or contact patients. Security will escort you to your locker to collect personal items. Rachel didn't argue. She'd known since she'd felt the weight of the code crashing down on her that this was coming. You don't save a life without consequences when the person you saved threatens the hospital's structure. You don't demonstrate that level of capability without making powerful people want to bury you. She'd already been buried once by the government. This time, at least, it was just a job. She'd walked out of St. Michael's at 2:24 p.m. with a cardboard box containing her name badge, 3 pens, and a half-eaten protein bar. The parking garage was nearly empty at that hour, mostly long-term spots for staff with shifts that started at midnight. She'd driven down to the basement level, the deepest level, where the fluorescent lights flickered and cast everything in a sickly green-white that made skin look like death. Engine off. Hands on the steering wheel. The termination letter on the passenger seat next to her phone. She couldn't remember how to make her hands unclench. 3 days. That's all the time she'd managed to buy herself before this moment. 3 days since she'd felt something other than the cold machinery of survival. She'd saved Captain Torres's life, and in saving him, she'd erased herself. Again. The government had told her what would happen if she surfaced, prison or worse, they said, for violating national security protocols that had never been signed, consent never given, just extracted from her through fear and classification stamps. Now the hospital had done the government's work for them. They'd solved the problem of her existence by making her disappear professionally, financially, officially. Her hands were locked around the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She was aware of the pain as data, the tendons in her forearms burning, the muscles in her shoulders locked in isometric tension, her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. But awareness and control were not the same thing. She'd learned that in Tikrit. The basement parking garage smelled like motor oil and something else, something faintly chemical that might have been the antifreeze leaking from the BMW 3 spots over. The sound of a distant elevator hum echoed off the concrete walls. Somewhere above her, in room 804, Captain Torres was still healing. His sternum was beginning to fuse. His lungs were beginning to remember how to work without help. His daughter would live. Rachel had given that to him, and now she was sitting in the dark with a termination letter and a classified file she couldn't acknowledge and a pair of combat boots in a locker 3 levels above that represented a life the government had spent 5 years trying to erase. She should have walked away from Captain Torres. Should have let Whitfield's medication error kill him. Should have kept her head down and waited out the 6 months of her temp contract and disappeared quietly into whatever job market would have her after this. But she hadn't. And now the rain was starting. The rain started exactly 48 hours after Rachel's termination letter dried on her dashboard, and by hour 72, the parking garage was her only refuge, the concrete walls echoing nothing. She'd stopped checking her phone. The temp agency wasn't calling back. The hospital's legal department had already distributed her non-disclosure agreement through 3 separate firms to ensure her silence held teeth. What nobody knew was that her silence had always been enforced by something far more permanent than paperwork, a classification stamp that made her disappear the moment she tried to surface. 3 days passed in the kind of paralysis that comes from having already died once and knowing the paperwork never resets. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance only she understood. She was sitting in her car at 2:17 in the morning, watching the emergency bay entrance through the windshield, when the ambulance pulled in. Gunshot wounds. Robbery victim. The dispatch radio crackled across the hospital's open channel, male, 36, 2 penetrating GSWs to the right flank, BP 92 over 58, on 2 liters O2. She didn't go inside. She sat in the cold driver's seat and watched paramedics move with practiced efficiency, and she thought about Captain Torres lying in a hospital bed upstairs, recovering from complications she'd caught and Dr. Whitfield had ignored. She thought about the 16 hours she'd held a safe house alone in Tikrit while insurgents hammered the perimeter, thought about the young girl whose bone marrow had come from a needle stick and a classified name. She thought about 3 Purple Hearts stored in a duffel bag under her mattress, a Navy Cross that no longer existed, and combat boots that were the only proof she'd ever been anything other than a temporary nurse with inadequate documentation standards. The paramedics transferred their patient inside. Rachel watched the ambulance doors close. She was reaching for the ignition when the emergency bay doors burst open and a security guard she'd never seen before came running across the parking lot, his hand moving toward his radio like muscle memory from a life he'd tried to leave behind. His name tag read Mike Reyes, Veteran Services. Vietnam era tattoo on his forearm. Boots that had walked the same dust she'd walked. She started the engine. She was pulling out of the parking space when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Master Chief. The voice was clipped, military cadence underneath the civilian words. This is Dr. Patricia Chen, Seattle Grace Cardiac Surgery. You don't know me, but I know Marcus Whitfield. And I just saw a video that's about to make his career very difficult. Rachel's hand stayed on the steering wheel. I don't know what you're talking about. The vending machine incident. 43 seconds of him mocking your credentials with a dozen witnesses watching. It's going viral. My department posted a disavowal letter about 10 minutes ago. The hospital board is convening an emergency session at 0600. And someone just leaked your name to a 2-star general who's currently driving to St. Michael's with your complete classified file. A pause. The sound of rain in the background, same rain falling everywhere. Come back. Not for Whitfield. For yourself. Rachel hung up. She sat in the parking garage for 8 minutes, she counted them, and then she drove back to St. Michael's and walked through the emergency entrance with the composure of someone who had nothing left to lose, which meant she had everything to gain. The paramedics had just transferred their trauma patient to Trauma Bay 2. The triage nurse was calling a full trauma alert. And standing at the stretcher, staring at Rachel with eyes that went wide and then filled with something like recognition, was a man in his mid-30s with a bandage on his flank and something breaking across his face like sunrise. Valkyrie, he whispered. The word came out like a prayer. Not a question. Not a nickname. A call sign. The one they'd given her in Tikrit because she'd walked out of the safe house on the 16th hour when everyone assumed she'd been dead for 12. You're still? Trauma Bay. Move. Rachel's voice dropped an octave. No hesitation. No permission asked. The paramedic moved. The trauma nurses moved. Mike Reyes, the security guard with the Vietnam tattoo, stopped mid-stride and said Master Chief, with his hand actually moving toward a salute before he remembered where he was and let his arm drop slowly to his side, but not before Rachel saw the tears start at the corners of his eyes. She didn't acknowledge it. She was moving into trauma protocol, her hand steady as surgical steel, calling for 2 large bore 4s and type O negative, reading the monitor like it was a language she'd spoken for 23 years because it was. Who is he? She asked the paramedic, not looking up from the wound assessment. Farhan al-Aziz. Iraqi national. Robbery at gunpoint 3 blocks from his apartment. We got the bleeder controlled en route. Rachel's hands froze for exactly 1 second. Farhan. The interpreter from Tikrit. The one who'd helped her coordinate extraction for the families during the safe house siege. The one who'd gotten out through the refugee program 5 years ago and disappeared into the Portland medical system as a billing administrator at Legacy Emmanuel because she'd made 3 phone calls to people who owed her favors, all of them now dead or retired or disappeared. Okay, Farhan, she said, and his eyes tracked to hers, and he understood. Stay with me. You know the drill. Oxygen. Pain management. Let me see what we've got. Within 20 minutes, the trauma was stabilized. Penetrating wounds missed the kidney by 2 centimeters, missed the spleen by 0.5. By the time Dr. Whitfield arrived on the floor, called in because he was on call and protocol demanded the department chief supervise traumas, Rachel had already coordinated with radiology, called up a surgical team, and prepared Farhan for a CT scan that would determine if he needed the OR or could be managed with conservative observation and antibiotics. Step back, nurse, Whitfield said, his voice carrying the edge it always carried when he felt threatened. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who'd spent 3 days believing he'd successfully erased an inconvenience, and now the inconvenience was standing in his trauma bay giving orders like she had the authority to do so. This is my patient now. Was my patient, Rachel corrected. Her voice was flat. Her eyes were flat. And in that flatness, Mike Reyes heard something that made his hand move toward his radio. Stable vitals, imaging ordered, surgical standby if CT shows active bleed. Your call on disposition after imaging, doctor. She walked out of the trauma bay. She did not run. She did not tremble. She walked to the supply closet and waited because she knew what was coming, knew it the way you know an incoming mortar, by the sound of impact before the explosion. The hospital paging system announced an emergency board meeting. 45 minutes later, Rachel was called to the administrative wing. She came in soaking wet from the rain, her scrubs still stained from the trauma, her face composed like concrete. The hospital board sat at one end of a polished oak table. At the other end sat a man in a dress uniform so covered in ribbons it looked like someone had arranged actual violence across his chest in decorative patterns. Two-star General Robert Kane. Grey at the temples. Eyes like a fighter pilot who'd seen too much sky. He stood when she entered, and every board member shifted uncomfortably because generals don't stand for temporary nurses. Master Chief Torres, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm General Kane, SOCOM Pacific. I'm holding your classified service file, and I've been authorized to release specific information to this board so they understand what they've just terminated. He opened a manila folder, and the room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star. And a Navy Cross for solo operation, Tikrit, 2011, Safe House Designation Juliet 7, 16 hours elapsed. Hostile force neutralized, 0 friendly casualties, 9 non-combatants extracted. Board members blinked. One of them looked like he was trying to calculate how someone could have 2 jobs simultaneously. Dr. Whitfield, standing in the corner with his arms crossed, had gone the color of old porcelain. The video circulating online, General Kane continued, shows Dr. Whitfield mocking this woman's credentials approximately 48 hours before she saved his patient's life through advanced cardiac intervention. Her medical documentation wasn't inadequate. It was precise. Her credentials weren't questionable. They were classified. And her temporary status at this hospital was a condition of her witness protection, which Dr. Whitfield systematically violated through public humiliation. This is outrageous, Whitfield said, his voice climbing an octave. I had no idea. That's the problem with arrogance, doctor. You stop noticing what's actually in front of you. General Kane closed the folder. Master Chief Torres is being offered full reinstatement with back pay and a formal apology. She's also being offered the position of director for your hospital's new veteran care wing, which will open in 90 days. The position comes with 0 supervision from cardiothoracic, complete operational autonomy, and a salary reflecting her actual rank and experience. Dr. Whitfield, you're being referred to the State Medical Board for ethics review based on the documented pattern of harassment, false complaints, and violation of patient safety protocols. Whitfield's jaw worked like a fish. A board member cleared his throat. Another one was already drafting an apology in his head. Rachel could see it in the way his eyes weren't tracking anymore. Then the hospital room door opened and Captain James Torres walked in, still moving carefully because his sternotomy was 3 weeks fresh, but walking. Behind him came Farhan Al-Aziz in a hospital gown, his full line trailing on a rolling stand because he disconnected it himself to come to this meeting, which was exactly the kind of thing soldiers did when they needed to stand witness. Sir, Captain Torres said to the general, requesting permission to make a statement. Granted. This woman, Torres said, looking directly at Rachel, and there was something in his voice like the sound of ice breaking in spring, donated bone marrow to my daughter 7 years ago. My daughter was 12 years old and dying. I went through official channels, got my name on 3 lists, and the answer was no. I was military, she was military, and the answer was still no because the paperwork didn't match. Then someone made a phone call under a false name, and a woman I'd never met, who worked in a classified capacity I'm still not cleared to know about, underwent a bone marrow extraction that left her in chronic pain for 18 months. My daughter is 17 now. She volunteers at St. Jude's. She's alive because this woman chose to break the law to save her. Whitfield was backing toward the door. Not running, but definitely leaving. His face had gone from porcelain to ash, and his eyes had the look of someone watching his own execution in slow motion. The board president stood up and said, "Dr. Whitfield, you are suspended, effective immediately, pending the ethics board's investigation. You will surrender your hospital credentials and your office keys before you leave this building." Rachel stood in the center of the room, and nobody was asking her permission, nobody was waiting for her to speak. The general was reading from her classified file with the official cadence of someone making it permanent, making it real, erasing what the government had tried to erase. Captain Torres was telling her story to people who'd never asked her name. Farron was standing beside her with his full line like a tether, bearing witness. And Mike Reyes was watching from the doorway with tears running down his weathered face. She'd been erased once. They didn't do it twice. Within 6 hours, the vending machine video had 17 million views and the caption "Doctor humiliates Navy hero." Within 12 hours, Dr. Patricia Chen, the legendary cardiac surgeon who'd written Whitfield's recommendation letter for his fellowship, issued a public letter that read like a eulogy. "I am appalled and ashamed that someone I trained could display such cruelty and arrogance toward someone who sacrificed far more than he ever will. I hereby withdraw any professional endorsement of Dr. Marcus Whitfield and call for immediate ethics review of his medical practice." The hospital board convened an emergency session. The external investigator Whitfield had hired to justify Rachel's termination suddenly developed amnesia about the specifics of his interview. The 3 board members Whitfield had called in favors from suddenly remembered prior commitments and ethics violations on their own records that made them recuse themselves. Patient families began requesting his removal from their cases. The state medical board opened a formal investigation. A lawsuit started moving through the system like a snowball rolling downhill, gathering mass and momentum. By week's end, Dr. Whitfield was on administrative leave with pay suspended. By the second week, his wife filed for separation. The country club membership was quietly revoked. His children transferred to private schools. And Rachel Torres walked through St. Michael's with her credentials restored, her name erased, her identity finally real. The Rose Garden ceremony happened on a Thursday in June. 200 people stood in the sunlight while the president called her name, while photographers flashed, while she stood in her dress blues, first time wearing them in 6 years, with her Navy cross pinned where it was supposed to be. General Kane shook her hand. Captain Torres's daughter cried. Farron stood in the back with Mike Reyes, both of them proud in the way that only people who'd walked the hard roads understood. 6 months later, Rachel Torres walks through the new veteran care wing at St. Michael's every morning at 06:15, her worn combat boots on her feet, still polished but never replaced, because you don't replace the things that kept you alive. The boots have Tikrit sand still in the treads. She's never cleaned them out. The wing serves 43 veterans weekly with specialized PTSD-informed care, staffed partially by former corpsmen she's personally recruited. Captain Torres's daughter volunteers in the family lounge, 17 years old, healthy, alive. Farron Al-Aziz works as a translator for refugee patients and trauma survivors. Mike Reyes runs peer support groups for older veterans adjusting to civilian life. On her office wall, the Navy Cross in a frame, and beside it, a photograph from the Rose Garden ceremony where the president thanked her by name. Dr. Whitfield's credentials, by contrast, sit in a storage unit he can't afford to keep paying for. His medical license is suspended pending ethics review. His retirement is vaporized in legal fees. He sells supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall pharmacy on Southeast Division, same strip mall where the McDonald's drive-through line backs up at lunch, same intersection where nobody stops because nobody needs insurance policies from a man in a polo shirt with a name tag nobody remembers. His name is now a cautionary tale in medical schools across the country. Residents whisper it like a warning. One afternoon, Rachel sees him through the windshield as she drives past that strip mall on her way to OHSU for a speaking engagement. She doesn't stop. She doesn't slow. She doesn't acknowledge. Her hands stay on the steering wheel. Her eyes stay forward. That evening, she stands in front of a room of new nursing graduates in her dress blues for the first time since the Rose Garden, and she speaks the way she's learned to speak, with the authority of someone who's earned every word. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching, she says. When no one will thank you. When you're erased and silenced and told you never mattered. You do the right thing anyway. Because the alternative is becoming something less than human, and that's a cost I've never been willing to pay. In the back row, a young veteran in scrubs with a prosthetic leg wipes her eyes. Rachel meets her gaze and nods once, the same nod she gave Dr. Whitfield in a hospital hallway months ago, but this time it means something different. This time it means welcome home. Subscribe for more stories of unsung heroes. Like this video if you believe the quietest person in the room deserves to be heard. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?